About 10 years ago, my wife and I were members of the Open Fuel Standard Coalition. We were trying to get a bill passed in Congress that would make it mandatory for car companies to change their fuel injectors so that they could burn gasoline or ethanol or methanol or any combination of those. The tweak that they would have to do would cost about $100 per car. But that simple change would have changed the world because it would allow fuels to compete with gasoline on an equal footing. People have been trying to compete with petroleum as a fuel for a long time, but usually they do it in such a way that you have to get a car that is specialized for something like a CNG car, a compressed natural gas car, which has its own fuel tank and way of filling up, or a hydrogen car, or an electric car. But none of those allow fuels to compete at the moment in the same way that, say, different cereal companies get to compete with each other at the moment of choice. But with something like an open fuel standard, where every car manufactured would be capable of, when you go to the gas station to fill up, or we should call it the fuel station to fill up, you would have a choice on the spot, in the moment. You could look at the prices, for example, and say, ethanol is cheaper today. I'm going to fill up with ethanol. Or methanol is cheaper today. Methanol is another alcohol. Ethanol is an alcohol. It's the same alcohol that you drink that's in vodka, for example. And methanol is another kind of alcohol that can also be burned as a fuel. But methanol can be made out of all kinds of things, including natural gas. But it can also be made out of garbage. And so with something like that, the fuels could compete with each other, and the monopoly that the petroleum industry has right now would disappear. Because there are many different ways to make ethanol and many different ways to make methanol. And so each one of those ways could compete with each other, and they could all compete with gasoline. The situation, as it has existed since the early 1970s, is that the price of oil has been inflated artificially because there's a kind of monopoly on it. What happened was Saudi Arabia got together with a bunch of other oil producing companies and said, look, if we gather together and decide in our own committee what price we're going to sell oil for, we could all be making a lot more money if we just cooperated. So I think they got originally 12 countries to participate in this, Iran and Venezuela and so on. And this was OPEC. Well, it still is OPEC. And OPEC has been controlling the price of oil for a really long time and making those countries make massive amounts of money while costing a lot of money for the rest of the world. The price of fuel really matters for the global economy. Everything is moved around with fuel. So when the price of fuel goes up, it costs everybody. It's like a tax on the entire world. But with genuine fuel competition, that monopoly would be broken. They would lose their power to affect the world the way they have been for the last almost 50 years. When we were part of the Open Fuel Standard Coalition, I did a lot of writing and reading about this. And one of the books I read that was really fascinating was called Salt, A World History. Salt has really played a key part in history for a long time. For thousands of years, it was the only way to preserve food. So you could pickle things by putting salt in it, or you could dry things and salt it. It was the only way to preserve food. And everybody wanted it. It's also a necessary nutrient, so everybody actually needs it. It was such a key element in world history. Wars were fought over it, and wars were won because of it. If an army is on the move, what do they need with them? They need food, and they need food that's not going to spoil on the way. There's no refrigeration back then, so the only way you could do that is with salt. If you didn't have any salt, you are in deep doo-doo. You can't fight a war. You can't defend yourself even. You can't put armies in the field. Anybody that can control a source of salt had power. In other words, it was a single commodity that essentially had a monopoly over food preservation. So then what happened? What happened was people found other ways to preserve food. So there was competition for food preservation, and the strategic significance of salt diminished. Now nobody cares where salt comes from. Well, I guess some people, gourmets do, but for the most part, there's no wars being fought over salt anymore. It's really insignificant. There are many, many ways to preserve food. And that's what the open fuel standard was trying to do with gasoline, is to reduce its strategic significance. Because if you could do that, then all of the OPEC nations, who are, for the most part, bad actors in the world, would lose their power. And it would really boost the economy, because everything would be less expensive, because it doesn't have that extra added, essentially huge tax we've been paying to OPEC for all these years. And really all oil producers. All oil producers have been benefiting by OPEC's raising of the price of oil. Oil producers have been benefiting, and investors in oil companies have been benefiting, and everybody else has not been benefiting. Everybody else has been having to pay an extra tax to these very wealthy people. That would all be over if we had true fuel competition. When I first started learning about this, I didn't even realize that an internal combustion engine could burn ethanol, but they've been doing it since actually the beginning. One of the first Ford cars was a flex fuel vehicle. It could burn either gasoline or alcohol, ethanol, or both at the same time. At the time, there were farms all over the country, and most farms had stills, because they would just take whatever excess corn or whatever they had and distill it into ethanol. First of all, ethanol is useful. You can use it in lamps to make light. You can drink it, but it's also storable. It doesn't go bad. So you can't keep a bunch of corn, right? Pretty soon, the corn is completely worthless. But if you ferment it and turn it into alcohol, you can now sell it. You can use it for fuel. You can drink it. It's valuable, and it stores. So farms all over the country would do that with their excess produce. They would just ferment it into ethanol. And so most places had ethanol. Most areas where you were had ethanol. So if you couldn't, and there wasn't a lot of gas stations around when cars first started, there were hardly any. So if you needed some fuel, you could just go to a farm and say, hey, do you have any ethanol I could buy from you? And they usually did. Put it in your tank and drive away. Find out what you can do to make fuel competition a reality when we come back. This Atom Bomb podcast episode is sponsored by Anchor, a podcast platform, the one I'm using to make this podcast. It's super easy to use and allows you to easily create your own podcast. You can record and edit your audio right onto the app. In fact, you can do everything on your phone. Anchor also makes it easy to monetize your podcast and get wide distribution. Anchor automatically makes your podcast available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. You can download the Anchor app for free or go to anchor.fm to get started. And it's really not that difficult to make a car capable of burning both ethanol and methanol, or ethanol and gasoline and methanol. Methanol is slightly more corrosive. All it really takes is that you need to make sure that the fuel lines can take the alcohol, won't get dissolved by the alcohol. And you change the fuel injection, the ratio of oxygen to fuel, so that it burns well. And that's it. That's all. They used to do it on I think it was a Model T or Model A or something. They just had basically a manual choke, and you'd start it up, and then you just turn this choke until it was idling well, and then take off. But modern ones just use the fuel injector, and it reads how rich the fuel is after it's been burnt, and if it's too rich, then adds more oxygen, so it burns more completely. And that's it. It just kind of does it automatically. And most cars easily do it. As a matter of fact, when we were reading about this, we wondered if our car could do it. So we just put ethanol directly into it's not a flex fuel vehicle, but we just put it into our gas tank, and it ran perfectly. As a matter of fact, in many ways, it ran better than it did on gasoline, because ethanol is high octane. As a matter of fact, they added to gasoline to make gasoline burn better. For something like 70 years, they added lead to gasoline to do the same thing, to add oxygen, to raise the octane level so that the gasoline could burn well. But of course, lead is toxic. They actually were going to originally, they already knew about ethanol way back when, of course, when they were first deciding what they needed to add to gasoline to make it burn better. They knew about alcohol, but they didn't want to, the oil industry did not want to give any money or business to their competition. At the time, they had a direct competition with ethanol, and they wanted to crush that competition. So one of the things they did is they added lead to the gasoline rather than giving any money to the ethanol industry. And of course, lead is poisonous and really poisoned the air for a long time. As a matter of fact, there's a really good article in, I think it's Mother Jones, and they made a very compelling case that the rise in violent crime in the 80s and 90s was largely due to, and I guess 70s, was largely due to the amount of lead in the air. Check it out. It's really interesting. It's very convincing. And then it was outlawed. The petroleum industry could no longer add lead to gasoline, and the lead levels in the atmosphere have dropped. And with it, the violent crime levels have dropped. A lot of people are against burning ethanol, largely because of a really successful disinformation campaign by the petroleum industry to make people not like ethanol. One of the main arguments against it is that you make ethanol out of corn, out of food. There's people starving in the world, and you're making fuel out of food. It's just wrong. But it doesn't have to be made out of food. It could be made out of garbage. It could be made out of anything. There could be a whole industry of different ways of making alcohol out of garbage. No problem. The only reason it's being made out of corn now is because quite a while ago, the government set up a program so that farmers wouldn't go out of business. Because what used to happen is that if farmers happened to grow a lot, if it was a really good year for corn, there was a huge amount of corn on the market, and then prices would plunge, and then farmers would go out of business because they spent the whole year growing this corn, and now it's essentially worthless or worth very little, not enough to pay their bills, right? So they'd go out of business. And then there would be a corn shortage in a few years, because all these farmers went out of business, or nobody wanted to grow it because it didn't make any money. So the government was like, okay, so we need to somehow steady this out so that people keep producing this food, right? We need the food. So they basically hired all of these scientists to figure out what we could do with the corn besides sell it as corn. And one of the things they came up with was high fructose corn syrup, which wasn't a good one. But another thing they came up with is you could make ethanol fuel out of it. You could use it as a fuel. The whole idea then is that there would be a constant and steady market for corn, even if they couldn't sell it as corn, or as, most corn is sold as a feed for cattle. So there would be a steady market, and the farmers wouldn't go out of business. And that's been going on for a long time, and it's worked pretty well. But that's why it's made out of corn. There's no reason that you can make ethanol out of just about any plant material. And there's all kinds of innovative ways people have come up with to make ethanol. They've actually made an algae that can make diesel fuel as an excrement. It poops out diesel fuel, just turns the sunlight and water into diesel fuel. Somebody else came up with a way to heat up garbage and heat it up to a certain temperature. I don't remember what it was, 800 degrees or something. And it causes the molecules to come apart, and then they can rearrange them into fuels. In this case, they rearranged it into methanol fuel. So they turned garbage into methanol fuel and produced electricity at the same time by burning the garbage. So there's a lot of different ways to do this, and it doesn't have to be corn. But the petroleum industry has focused everybody's attention on that aspect of it because it gets public backlash. It works in their favor. At the time I was working on the open fuel standard and learning about it, I was really surprised that the bill wasn't getting much traction in Congress, only to find out that the petroleum industry really gives a lot of money to Congress people for their campaigns, right? So they kind of owe them, right? So it was weird that the bill, which was great, it was a really awesome, clean bill, wouldn't cost anything to the taxpayers, and it got nowhere. It would have done so much good, and it went nowhere. And then, like a whole coalition of car companies came out adamantly against the open fuel standard. And I was like, what is that about? That just really surprised me. Then I find out oil companies have been investing in car companies for a long time. So they have a say at the board of these car companies. And car companies have invested a lot of money into oil industry. So they're very in bed with each other, very much so. Anyway, the whole thing was kind of a great disappointment and disillusionment. But the idea still stands, and it's still entirely possible. What can be done about it? Well, one thing that could be done is that more people could know about it. That would help. If you want to read more about it, a really good book is Energy Victory by Robert Zubrin. We also wrote a book about it called Fill Your Tank with Freedom. Another thing you could do is the next time you buy a car to get a flex fuel vehicle, because those are made to be able to burn ethanol and or gasoline. And there are a lot of places in the country, this is in the US, I mean, that make ethanol more available, especially in the Midwest where there's a lot of corn growers. So people want to support their farmers. They can buy E85 usually. I mean, I think some places I think even sell it all the way up to 100%. E85 means it's 85% ethanol and 15% gasoline. The gasoline you normally buy at the gas station is usually E10. It's got 10% alcohol in it. But you can buy, in some places in the country, you can buy 100% ethanol. And there's some gas stations that actually just have, you can just put whatever percentage you want in there. But the oil industry has really limited the availability of ethanol. They have agreements with their own, like Shell has an agreement with the Shell owners, Shell station owners. It's like a franchise. And some of them, I don't know which ones, but probably Chevron, Shell, have an agreement with their franchise owners that they won't put any other company's fuel to be available in their station. So they've really helped suppress the availability of E85 or ethanol as a fuel. But there are a lot of places in the country that still have it, and we can actually find it around here. This is Washington State. So there's still some people that make it available. So that's another thing you could do. And another thing you could do if you ever see anything come up like this is a bill to help support it. That would help. There are a few things in this world that could really change the world. Fuel competition is one of them. This is Adam Lee Kahn on The Atom Bomb.